I'm here today with Peter Seglow, who seems to be the human who knew Norbert the longest being alive. You have known Norbert, I think, very early on and until his death. So when did you first meet Norbert Elias? Do you have a recollection? When did this happen?
No specific recollection. I have known Norbert all my life, from when we all first came to England, and I'm sure I met him when I was still a young child before the war. But my main memory of him is when he was already living in London, although we knew him very slightly when the LSE was in Cambridge, and my mother was a student of the LSE, and we occasionally met in Cambridge. But mostly my memory of him is in London, where we saw each other really quite often, not every week, but certainly every month. And he was like an honorary member of my family. So he lived opposite where we lived in Primrose Gardens. We lived at 26, I've forgotten the number he lived in, but it was diagonally across the road. And we saw each other, certainly not every week, but every 2 or 3 weeks.
How was your family relation to Norbert? How did your mother knew to Norbert?
My mother met Norbert because she was a student at Frankfurt University, and she left very early, within literally hours of Hitler coming to power. She was warned by a policeman who was a social democrat that he already had a warrant for her arrest, and this had less to do with being Jewish, but a great deal to do with the fact that she was a very active and very well-known member of the Communist Party. Okay. Right? And so we left at a few hours' notice. This is long before my parents were married, and not obviously, but before I was born. And we went to Paris. My mother explains how they went first, before they went to Paris, they went to Saarbrücken, because the Saarland at that time was a League of Nations mandated area. It wasn't formally part of Germany. And from Saarbrücken, my mother says, or claims, that she phoned Norbert every week or every few days to say, has the monster gone yet? Can I come home? Okay. And Norbert said, for God's sake, stay away. And then we went to Paris, where I was born in September 1934. And we stayed in Paris only a short while after I was born. And I'm sure we would have seen Norbert in Paris as well. But then, shortly after I was born, within 2 or 3 months, we went back to Germany. So I spent my mother got a job at a Jewish kindergarten in Berlin, which was run by Nelly Wolfheim. I don't know if the name is familiar to you.
I've heard it.
You've heard it. And she worked there at the kindergarten. I have photographs of myself in Berlin, but no memories. And then in 1937, we came to England. And then within 2 years, my grandparents, her parents, also came to England. That would have been, I think, in March 1939. And I have a clear memory of them getting off the aeroplane in Croydon Aerodrome, it was called at the time, long before there was such a thing as Heathrow or anywhere like that.
Okay.
Do you want me just to go on?
Yes, wonderful.
We went, one of my first memories is of going with my mother and her sister, my aunt Eve, she called herself in English, although her real name was Laura. And we met in Lungern in Switzerland in the summer of 1938. I would have been 4. We were already living in England. And it was a last attempt by my mother and her sister to try and persuade their parents, that is to say my grandparents, to leave Germany before it was too late. And they succeeded. And they were helped in that, I think, but I'm not sure, by a man whose name I've forgotten, but it's in my book, but he was the British Consul General in Frankfurt.
Okay.
And he helped a lot of German Jews, well, I don't know about a lot, but it certainly helped some get out, because it was getting out of Germany was at that time not very difficult. The difficulty was find somewhere where you could go.
Yeah.
Right. And my mother got a job here in a very curious school, because the children would already in the kindergarten, from the 3-4 years old, grow up speaking 4 languages: English, German, French and Spanish. And a requirement for the foreign language teachers was that they should not be able to speak English.
Okay.
Because if they could speak English, then the children, if there was a gap in understanding, would of course speak English to the teachers. And my mother, when she came to England, I think spoke no English, so she got a job as a German teacher. It was called the Hampden School. It was somewhere in Holland Park. I went there myself until the beginning of the war, nearly the beginning of the war.
So you learned all these languages as well?
I personally didn't, because I wasn't, and I'm still not very good at languages, but the idea was that children would grow up with quadrilingual, with English, German, French and Spanish. And my mother met the head teacher through her sister, my aunt, who said, I've got a Spanish teacher and a French teacher, obviously an English teacher. I'm desperately looking for a German teacher, but it has to be a German teacher who cannot speak any English. And
she fulfilled this requirement.
Pardon?
Your mother fulfilled this requirement.
Yes.
She had no person.
And in Berlin, she had worked at a Jewish kindergarten, so she was a trained teacher, a trained nursery school teacher.
Yeah.
And we were there, and then in 1939, but before the war broke out, or maybe during that time, my mother got a scholarship to the LSE, the London School of Economics. By that time, of course, she spoke English. My mother was very good at languages. I'm not, but she was very good at languages. And then we all moved to Cambridge, where Norbert also was. I think we must have seen him there quite often. But Norbert, of course, was interned in the Isle of Man. It would have been at the end of 1939, beginning of 1940, if I got that right.
It was for about 10 months, I think. He
Something
was
like that.
Interned because he was a male and he was from Germany.
Yes.
And so all Germans were brought to Isle of Man, and he could only return after got clearance after 10 months.
Yeah, it wasn't all to the Isle of Man, and they weren't all interned. Many were, and some were actually sent to Canada.
Yeah.
And my grandfather was supposed to be interned, but they let him go because he was already then too old. So they thought he was he wouldn't try and assassinate the king.
Yeah.
So it would be all right. And then after the war, when we were living in London, and Norbert was also living in London, so we're now talking about probably the late 1940s, 48, 49, something like that, or maybe a little bit before, maybe 47. And Norbert moved into an apartment, a flat, which was across the road from where we were living, and we would see him every, 2 or 3 weeks. And I always think of him as a kind of honorary member of my family, because my mother lived in the house which was occupied by Erwin, her brother, and his wife Lydia. And it was a sort of open house for refugees, and there was as much German spoken as English. Und deshalb spreche ich immer noch Deutsch, aber obgleich ich nicht lange in Frankfurt gelebt habe, ist mir gesagt, dass ich Deutsch mit einer Frankfurter Aussprache noch spreche. I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, no,
a little bit.
A little bit. You
of
speak
a
a little German with a Frankfurt accent, yes.
Yeah, although I never lived in Frankfurt myself. I lived in Berlin.
You lived in Berlin?
Yes,
okay.
yes. I have photographs of myself in Berlin, yes.
Okay.
And my mother worked in this nursery school, and my father worked at the Jüdischer Kulturbund. He was the assistant director to a man called Fritz Wistens, who was the director, who wasn't German, he was Czech, of the Deutsche Kulturbund in Berlin.
Okay, at this
Okay.
time. And from the 1940s on to the 1950s, you know that Norbert, he moved away from London to Leicester, I think in the early 50s.
Yes, he got a job at some time in the 1950s to Leicester. He desperately wanted to get a permanent post at an English university, and he found it very, for all sorts of reasons, he found it very difficult. But eventually in 54, 55, he succeeded and he went to Leicester. But although he lived in Leicester and we continued to live in London, we still saw him, I especially still saw him every, 2 or 3 months. I would go to Leicester to meet him, or quite often he would come to London because I think he enjoyed going to the theatre and things like that, and we would go together.
So you were going to theatres and something like ballet, or what did you?
No, ballet not. Theatre, yes.
Yeah.
And the cinema.
The cinema, okay.
Yes. Especially a cinema up in Hampstead called the Everyman, which showed good films. It still exists.
Yeah.
The cinema.
Wow.
Yes.
It's still there. And your friendship moved from he is a friend of your mother to friendship with you as a person. Or
Norbert was a close friend of my mother and at that time also of my aunt. And because I had certain difficulty passing exams and therefore did not have the qualifications to go to university, it was Norbert who, every time I saw him, encouraged me to go to university. And through him, I got an interview at Liverpool University because he knew a man called Joe Banks, who was a reader in sociology at Liverpool University. And he arranged for me to have an interview with Joe Banks.
Yeah.
And Joe Banks interviewed, he said he will set a special exam for me. And if I pass the exam, I can go to Liverpool as a student, which is what I did in 1960. And Joe, who terribly nice, very, very, very helpful man. But in between, I did a lot of different jobs. I worked for some years for an advertising agency, for a market research company, and I spent 2 years in the army, which was there was conscription. I had no choice.
Yeah, of course.
It's where I learned to drive. But Norbert was I use the phrase an honorary member of my family, and I always thought of him as such. And I know he had quarrels with other people, but never with my mother. And we remained on good terms till he died in Amsterdam, I think, in 1990.
And he brought you into sociology somehow.
Not
only physically, but also
sociology. Yeah. My mother started writing her thesis, and my mother actually started work not as an academic, but on the stage. She was an actress.
Yeah.
Right? And so she started writing her thesis. I still have questionnaires which she sent to German actors. And Norbert, I think, was her supervisor. And the thesis was concerned with trying to explain why the prestige and status of theatres in Germany was unrelated to the size or the importance of the city in which they were located. And this had to do with theatre being part of what, of course, Norbert described as a civilizing process. Yeah. So the civilizing process included theatres, and that was supported in some cities in Germany much more than in others.
Yeah.
So Norbert was her supervisor, and she started writing a little bit, or she certainly sent questionnaires to various actors and actresses, or now of course you call them all actors,
Yeah.
But she had to give it up when we fled Germany very suddenly in January 1933.
Yes, of course. So
Or
she
February
abandoned
1933.
this doctoral thesis she prepared in Frankfurt.
Yes.
And she abandoned graduating in sociology. Actually, she turned
Yes,
over to
she
be
never
analyzed.
she never really graduated in sociology.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
she graduated. She worked in Breslau as a nursery school teacher.
Mm-hmm.
She trained to become a nursery school teacher,
Mm-hmm.
and worked for a while in Breslau.
Mm-hmm.
And but Frankfurt was, of course, was where her parents lived, and also where her sister. The two sisters were very close.
Mm-hmm.
They were much closer to each other than either of them was to Erwin, who was the brother, let alone Leo, who emigrated to the United States already, I think, in 1925, 26, something like that.
Yeah.
And we didn't see him again until long, long after the war.
Okay.
Occasionally he would come to London, or we would be in California.
So let's jump forward. When
Yes.
you became a sociologist in 1960, were you at all interested in the civilizing process? What were your topics, or how was?
My main interest was in what at that time was called industrial sociology, and more specifically in industrial relations. And the main courses which I took at Liverpool were courses in industrial sociology, and then for various reasons which have to do with after I left Liverpool, I became more and more interested in industrial relations. And this was during the late 1960s, early 70s, when industrial relations, the English phrase is hit the headlines in the newspapers every day. Every day there was another big strike.
Yeah.
And I became very interested in this, and I had some good connections with people in the British trade union movement who I would go and interview, and industrial relations were what then interested me. Margaret Thatcher killed the subject off, but certainly until she became Prime Minister, which I think she did in '79.
Yeah.
This was my main interest in life.
So you had this occupation, and then the movement was, you said, killed, but it was silenced down, and then the relevancy of this field of work.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, what really killed the subject off was there was the biggest strike they'd had in England since the war, which was in 1984-85, which was the miners' strike, which was against the proposed closure of a large number of coal mines.
Yeah.
And it was led by a man who was hated by the whole of the British press, although he was a very popular leader of the Mine Workers Union, a man called Arthur Scargill. He's still alive, I think. And after the government defeated the Mine Workers Union, because Margaret Thatcher was a good politician, so she made sure that when the miners went out on strike, there would be enough coal lying, waiting to be used to last for maybe a year or 2 years, so the miners couldn't win. There was no way the miners could win. So at that time, industrial relations were my main interest, and from time to time when I saw him, I would talk about this to Norbert, although by then he was, I think, already living either in Germany or in Amsterdam.
Yeah.
And every time he came to England, every time he was in England, and he came to England even after he was living in Germany. I don't know how often, but I mean, we would always make a point of meeting. By we, I mean not only him and me, but also my mother. And until they had a big row, my aunt, my mother's sister as well.
You mean Evelyn?
Pardon?
Eve, Evelyn.
Eve, yes, yeah. Eve, yes.
So let's speak a little bit about Eve. They were befriended since Frankfurt time too, Norbert and Eve, and
I think probably, but I'm not quite sure. The thing is, Eve was, I think, 7 years younger than my mother. My mother was born in 1900. Eve was born in 1907.
Yeah.
So the relationship between them was not as close as it would have been had they been ever closer in age.
Yeah.
But they became very, very close in England, and they would go on holiday together, and they were, as well as being sisters, they were also close friends, very close friends. Yeah.
And then there was this quarrel between Norbert and Eve at some point, and
Yes.
then he did cut her out, or
Yes,
yeah, or
she felt that he treated her badly. I mean, if you want, I'll go into the... Do you want me to go into the details or not?
A little, maybe. Just give me an idea.
She gave a big party every Christmas, which we were invited to. We means Norbert as well as my mother, and because I was young, myself as well. And it was because she gave this party, she was a great gourmet. She loved cooking. She was very good at it and cooked delicious meals. And one always gave Eve a present in exchange for being invited to the party. And one year there was a big row, a krach, between Norbert and Eve about something to do with the politics of Eastern Europe behind what was then called the Iron Curtain. And this was Eve's speciality. She worked for the BBC in the East European department, and she knew what she was talking about. And Eve and Norbert had a big row, and after that they didn't really see each other anymore. He was never invited again.
Okay.
He was invited once more, and as a present he bought her something which you could buy for a few penny at Woolworths, which was a quite deliberate insult. And after that they never spoke again.
Okay.
But it didn't affect relations between Norbert and Ilse. They remained friends until Norbert died until my mother died. My mother died in 1984. And Norbert died, of course, in 1990. But the other thing was, we haven't talked about this at all.
Yeah.
My mother ran a clinic called the London Centre for Psychotherapy.
Yeah.
And she needed a number of well-known people who would support her in starting this clinic.
Yeah.
And Norbert was one of her supporters. And the London Centre for Psychotherapy existed really until my mother died. It no longer exists in the form in which it did, because there were the two organizations where there are always incredible internal political disputes. One is psychotherapeutic organizations, and the other, believe it or not, is choirs where people sing. They all hate each other.
Okay.
And Norbert was one of the people who helped found the London Centre for Psychotherapy.
Yeah.
And it must be 5 or 6 years ago, the London Centre for Psychotherapy combined with two other therapeutic organisations, and today it's called British Psychotherapeutic Organisation or something like that. And every 2 years there is still a Ilse Seglow Memorial Lecture dedicated to her. And she ran this very effectively, and she had terrible problems running it because my mother was not very good politically. By politically, I mean, in terms of party politics, she knew what she was doing.
Yeah.
But in terms of the politics of running an organisation, and there's always politics running any organisation,
of course,
she was hopeless. And she took every dispute as a personal insult to her.
Yeah.
And when things became difficult for her personally, Norbert was one of the people to whom she turned for advice. She said, they're saying this and this, what should I say, what should I do? And this became much more difficult, of course, after he moved first to Germany and then to Amsterdam.
But she rang him up regularly.
Yeah, they kept on good terms. They were on good terms with each other until my mother died, yes.
Also,
I have a nice letter from Norbert to my mother when she died. Yeah.
And Norbert also, he was very involved with Group Analytic Society.
Yes.
And she too, and
this was through a man called Fuchs.
Yeah.
Yep, that's right.
It's right, yes. Sigmund Heinrich Fuchs.
Yeah.
And
I think my mother knew Fuchs from Frankfurt Days, but I'm not sure about that.
Probably they knew each other. They were at the
Probably,
venue
yes.
at this time
Yes.
in Frankfurt. And well, I think Norbert did not much publish on this behalf on group analytic and psychology.
Very little.
But he contributed in a kind of advising people or advising your mother.
Yes. He advised my mother, and he was somebody. He liked being asked for advice.
Yeah.
And because he knew a lot about a lot.
Yeah.
He always said things which were, if not always helpful, they were always interesting. And one of the things about Norbert which I remember, one of his better qualities, was that he made people think.
Yeah.
And he was very good at making people think.
Yeah.
So you would ask him a question, you would say, he would often answer with a sentence which began with the words, yes, but. And then it always revolved around what Norbert thought. And Norbert, of course, was very suspicious, as I'm sure you know, about most of British mainstream sociology in the 1960s. And he stuck out on his own. He was very much a man who thought his own theories were more important than anybody else's.
Yeah.
And of course, the fact that he knew a lot about a lot meant he could, and he was very good and enjoyed arguing.
Yeah.
That of course made it both easier and more difficult at the same time.
So he was some kind of outsider in the British sociology.
Very much, yes.
And you before told me you came to Leicester yourself.
Yes, I did.
After you graduated in Liverpool.
Yes, I did.
Going to Leicester, and you came to the Leicester Sociology Department.
I came to the Leicester Sociology Department.
So when was this, and did you have a connection with Norbert at this time? Or?
Very little, because I went. My main connection was with the man who supervised my thesis. I think you mentioned his name, Nikos Mousselis.
Yeah, from
and
Greece.
He was the supervisor of my thesis, and he was very nice and very helpful. And I went to one or two seminars which Norbert organized, but not very many. I mean, I say I went to Leicester. I did go to Leicester, but at that time I was already married. I think I already had a son. So I would go, but just for 1 or 2 nights, and fulfill the requirements of the department for residents.
Okay.
But my main contact was in Leicester was, as I said, my sister, who was an ordinary undergraduate. She's 12 years younger than I am. If you stick around another half an hour, you'll probably meet her.
Okay.
So I went to 1 or 2 of Norbert's seminars.
Yeah.
Always very interesting. I always learnt a lot. But there was always when anybody said anything, he would listen very carefully. Norbert was very good at listening.
Mm-hmm.
He would always agree with you, but...
And then he could proceed with saying something entirely opposing of what you're saying.
Not entirely, yes. I mean, he was... I mean, these were the days where the most famous person in international sociology was probably still Talcott Parsons, right? And Norbert and Talcott Parsons disagreed about more or less everything.
Yeah.
And Norbert saw himself as setting sociology on its right path, which was very different from the kind of structural functionalism which was part of Talcott Parsons' kind of sociology.
Yeah.
So there we are. So,
and the atmosphere in the Leicester department, it was a growing department. Norbert was one of the senior members, of course.
Yes, he was a so-called reader.
Yeah.
Which is the same rank as a senior lecturer. He never became a professor.
He never became a professor. And it was under leadership of Ilya Neustadt. He was still the strong man at this time? Or what was
Ilya was the head of the department, and being the head of the department carries a certain, obviously, power and weight.
Mm-hmm.
The head of the department decides what happens in the department.
Mm-hmm.
And Ilya, I think was originally from Romania, but I don't know that. And he studied in in Belgium, I think.
Yeah,
At Liège or Louvain or somewhere like that.
Yeah.
And Elio was good at, like Norbert, was good at languages. Norbert's English was remarkably good, and his French was completely fluent. And I'm sure he also knew Latin and Greek. I mean, educated people at that time did. Not my mother, who was bad at languages. No, she wasn't bad at languages, but she failed the. She failed the exam you have to take to get into a university, so she went as a mature student, which is, I followed her footsteps, which is exactly what I did.
That's exactly what you did.
Yeah. And, oh look, there's somebody.
So.
They are selling the flat upstairs. There's somebody coming down to look at it there.
Okay.
So,
yeah, and this was in the 1970s. So you came to Leicester, you picked up your degree, you got your doctoral degree from Leicester?
No, it wasn't a doctor, it was a master's degree.
It was a master's
I don't have a doctoral degree.
Okay.
No.
And you got a master's degree from Leicester in a course by Nikos Musaidis?
Yes.
And but in industrial relations?
No, it was in sociology, but I mean, to get a master's degree, you had to take an exam, but above all, you had to write a thesis.
Okay.
And my thesis was basically about industrial sociology, more industrial sociology. It was about workplace relations.
Yeah.
I've still got a copy, I think, somewhere. I don't know where. And Nikos was very nice, very helpful, very nice as well. And I don't think I had much help from Norbert. I mean, I'm sure Norbert would have given me help had I asked for it, but I didn't think I needed it. The person's whose help I needed was obviously the man who was going to be my supervisor and therefore ipso facto my examiner.
How much did you know about Norbert's writing at this time? You knew him as a person?
A very little bit. I've forgotten when the civilizing process was first published in English. I mean, the big German edition, I mean, after the one which was published in Basel in 1939, the big German edition, I don't know when that came out. It must have been the late 50s, early 60s.
The 60s.
I've got a copy here. Yeah. And then he gave it, he really wanted to have it translated, but he was dissatisfied with lots of translators. And eventually he found somebody who did do the translation. Okay. And I think he was pleased with it. And having read it both in English and in German, I think it's a good piece of work. Good
translation. Yeah. And that's when you first noticed his writings at all.
Well, I knew from early days on that he'd always written, because he started, as I explained, in the late 1950s. My mother and Norbert would meet for lunch every so often at a well-known restaurant in London. And he explained how he was writing an article for, I think, the first issue of the British Journal of Sociology. And it was about the English naval officer. And they asked him to make a number of amendments. And making the amendments, because he was very fussy, took him longer than writing the original article. Yeah. So the first big thing he wrote in English, he wrote together with, what's his name, Scottson.
John Scottson,
The Established and the Outsiders.
Yeah.
And if you actually think about it, I didn't at the time, but afterwards I did, that in a way the Established and Outsiders, there's a kernel of a new kind of sociological theory which lies behind it.
Yeah.
Although the actual book was about a new town somewhere near Leicester.
Yeah.
But that was the empirical part, which was written by Scottson.
Yeah.
The theoretical part, I'm told, was all written by Norbert.
Yeah.
And after that, Norbert, I don't know if he suffered or whatever it is, a kind of writer's block, but he certainly had difficulty writing. And after that was published, he began publishing a lot more things.
Yeah.
In English as well as, I don't know whether most of his early things were in English or in German, or maybe in both.
He switched over to English at this period.
He switched over to English, yes.
But he also began revisiting his older books, like The Court Society and The Civilizing Process.
Yes.
And of course, he became an English author at this period.
Very much so, yes.
Yeah.
But when I was studying sociology, both as an undergraduate and as a graduate, most people had never heard of him.
Yeah, of course.
He was unknown. I actually, after I became an academic myself, and I went to Brunel University, and the head of my department, he was also a man who had brilliant original ideas, and today nobody's ever heard of him. I've met two really original thinkers in my life. One was Norbert Elias, and the other was Elliot Jacques. Elliot Jacques was originally a Canadian psychiatrist who had a brilliant theory of organizations. Nobody's ever heard of him anymore, but he was a brilliant original thinker.
But he did not publish as much as Norbert.
No, he published a huge amount. I've got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So
mostly about time.
Yeah. So
the concept of time he wrote about.
Okay. Just returning to Norbert.
Yes.
You left Leicester after you graduated.
Yes.
And Norbert left Leicester, moving to Germany back, and later on to Amsterdam.
Yes.
You stayed in touch with him?
Yes.
What happened?
Not a lot. I mean, whilst he was in Germany, and I think also when he was in Holland, he would come to England. I don't know how often, certainly more than once a year, maybe 2 or 3 times a year. He stayed in a very nice hotel in the West End called the White House, which is a kind of luxury apartments. You rent an apartment, and we would always meet. We would mean he and my mother, but often I was there as well, and they would talk about anything and everything.
Okay. And he stayed for some period in London, and then he returned back to the continent. That's what he regularly did.
Yes, I mean it was clear, looking back on it, that what he really wanted was to get a chair, that is, to become head of a department of sociology in England. But for all sorts of reasons, partly because his theories were the English word is esoteric, you know what I mean by that, not mainstream, unto themselves, right?
Yeah.
You believed in Norbert Elias or you believed in British mainstream sociology.
Yeah.
It was impossible to believe. Impossible is übertrieben, but it was difficult to believe in both.
Yeah,
so if you like Norbert Elias, you ipso facto had to be critical of much of English sociology.
Okay. And that's why he became some kind of special branch and within the British University. Somehow also established as a branch. I think then at this time the first Norbert Elias conferences took place here.
Yes.
In the 80s in Oxford, I think.
Yes, I think so. And then there was a big Norbert Elias celebration, I think in 1980 in Aachen, in Germany, to which I went. My mother went as well.
Okay.
Well, I mean, Norbert liked being the centre of attention. He liked being listened to. And as he usually had a lot of interesting things to say about lots of things. Especially thanks to Eric Dunning, he became very interested in sport, of course, which was Eric Dunning's big thing.
Yeah.
And he wrote a lot about sport.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting stuff. Yes.
Yeah. Then he moved over. Yeah. So Norbert became a star somehow. You mentioned Aachen. You mentioned.
I mean, you will know better than me. He never really became a star in England.
In England?
I think he became much more of a star first in Germany and then later thanks to Job Hotspur in Holland.
Yeah.
And Norbert and Job, who of course I also knew, became good friends. And there was a big conference to mark the publication of the collected works of Norbert Elias, where Job also came.
Yes,
and I went.
2014. Yes.
Yeah, and I went as well. Yeah. And I don't know. Have you? Does the name Earl Hopper mean anything to you?
No.
Ah.
Earl Hopper.
Earl Hopper fell under Norbert's influence to begin with.
Yeah.
He started off. He was American. Is American.
Okay.
And there was some sort of exchange program between the University of Leicester and and Washington University, which wasn't in Washington but in St. Louis. And people from St. Louis would come for 1 or 2 semesters to Leicester, and people from Leicester would go from 1 or 2 semesters to St. Louis. And one of these was Earl Hopper. And Earl Hopper came to England, and he became good friends with Norbert, and became good friends with my mother as well, and then moved first to Cambridge and then to the LSE, and then decided he wasn't a sociologist after all, but what he really wanted to do was psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
And he became, and still is today, one of the better known, probably most expensive psychoanalysts in London. He lives not far from here. I see him not very often, but from time. We're sort of friends, not good friends, but we're certainly
friendly terms with
yeah.
No, I wasn't aware of this.
Yeah. So my mother knew a lot of people in the department. I mean, members of staff at the Department of Sociology at Leicester University. The joke was told that half of the department was in treatment with my mother. Whether that's, I'm sure that's an exaggeration, but certainly there were 1 or 2
there were people
of whom Earl Hopper was a lot. If you're interested, I can give you his phone number.
Oh yeah, could be.
Yeah.
Well, if I have the necessary amount of money, but yeah.
Yes.
No, it's interesting. Yeah. So that's return. So I think Norbert died in 1990.
Yes.
You heard about it probably through a friend or something, and how did
I think I heard probably through your costume. Who I knew, whose acquaintance I always knew, and he lived in the Hobsbawm house. He had a flat in their house, I think. And I think I heard about it through Yup, or maybe there were a lot of obituaries in various English newspapers. Yeah. But I think I heard about it personally first, but I can't be certain. Yeah. I find it hard to say, but 1990 is now 33 years ago.
Yeah. So that's a closure with your relation with Norbert. Just for understanding, you stayed in touch with the circle around Norbert? And
Not really.
But you had contact with Job, and you came over in 2014 to the celebration of the
Yes, I did.
works.
Yes,
so,
I
that's
did.
where we met first.
Yes. I think it was my mother who was particularly keen on going. And because she was old and had difficulty travelling, and at that time I could still drive. I've given up driving. I don't drive anymore. But at that time I drove everywhere, and she wanted to get to Aachen, and so I drove her there. And of course, because I knew Norbert, I also attended 1 or 2 meetings to mark his birthday. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a roundup, I would say. Thank
Good.
you very much.
Okay. You're very welcome.